are some topics you study because they interest you. There are some topics you teach because they matter. And then there are some topics you come to understand because they interrupted your life. Burnout was that topic for me. It wasn't an abstract concept, it wasn't a trend. Burnout was a part of the story that eventually became the Nightingale Firm. It was the doorway that led me into deeper questions about leadership, work, well being, performance, recovery, and what it actually costs human beings to keep carrying demands that were never designed with their full humanity in mind. And because this episode releases on August 26th, my birthday, it feels appropriate to come back to where much of this work began. So, here is episode 7, The Number of Completion. Burnout was the beginning of this work for me, but burnout is no longer the whole story. Because today's episode is called Burnout is an Outcome, Not the Beginning of the Story. Here's what I want you to understand by the time we're finished. Burnout is real. Burnout is measurable. Burnout deserves serious attention. But burnout is often a downstream outcome of a story that has been unfolding for a long time. And if we only begin paying attention once someone is burned out, we have entered the story too late. Not hopelessly late, but late. So today, I want to take you upstream. Let's begin with what we know. The World Health Organization includes burnout in ICD 11 as an occupational phenomenon, not a medical condition. And that distinction is important. It describes burnout as resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed and identifies 3 dimensions. The dimensions are energy depletion or exhaustion, increased mental distance from one's job or cynicism related to the job, and reduced professional capacity. Burnout is not simply having a difficult week. It isn't ordinary fatigue, and it isn't something we should dismiss as attitude or complaining or lack of resilience. Burnout has been studied for decades, and importantly, burnout can be measured. For years, the Maslow Burnout Inventory has been one of the primary instruments I have used in my burnout coaching and consulting work. The MBI, which is short for the Maslow Burnout Inventory, helps answer an important question. What does the burnout profile look like? I have often administered it alongside the areas of work life survey, which helps identify where mismatches may be occurring in the person's relationship with the workplace. Those instruments have been valuable to my practice. They still have value. I remember facilitating a workshop once when a senior leader told me he didn't realize burnout could actually be measured. He thought it was theoretical. And I remember thinking, this is exactly why this work matters. Because when leaders don't understand burnout, they can easily misinterpret what they're seeing. Exhaustion becomes poor attitude. Cynicism becomes disengagement. Reduced effectiveness becomes a performance problem. And sometimes the person experiencing it gets reduced to they just can't handle the job anymore. Measurement gave us a better language, and I respect that. But after years of studying burnout, measuring it, working with people experiencing it, and experiencing it myself, I became increasingly interested in another question. What happened before the burnout score? What was happening 6 months earlier? What had been changing? What was being depleted? What had the person started compensating for? What had become normal that probably should never have become normal? And what signals appeared long before anyone used the word burnout? Because the burnout score tells me something important about where someone is now. I also want to understand how they got there. There's a theory in psychology that helps us understand part of this process. It's called conservation of resources. It was developed by psychologist Stephen Hopfall. At its core, conservation of resources theory proposes that people work to obtain, retain, protect, and build resources they value. Stress can emerge when those resources are threatened and when they are actually lost or when we invest significant resources and don't receive the return we expected. And one of the most important ideas in this theory is that resource loss can compound. Think about what that can look like in real life. You're exhausted, so recovery becomes harder. Your attention is depleted, so decisions require more effort. Your patience is shorter, so relationships become more difficult to navigate. Your support system is drained, so you compensate alone. You compensate by investing more of yourself, which consumes still more of the resources you were already struggling to protect. Loss has momentum. And here's what makes this especially important in organizations. The person may still be performing while the resources supporting that performance are disappearing underneath them. That's the part we often miss. We see the presentation delivered, the client served, the patient cared for, the crisis managed, the team held together. So we assume the system is working, but output alone cannot tell you what the output costs. High performance can conceal resource loss, and by the time performance finally changes, the depletion may have been underway for months, or in many of my clients' cases, years. That is why I'm interested in the history behind the outcome. What was being depleted? What was being threatened? What was the person repeatedly spending to remain functional? And where could the loss have been interrupted before burnout became the visible result? The nurse in me kept asking one question. Nursing trained me to see the person, not just the symptom, not just the task, not just the diagnosis, the person. By the time someone was lying in the hospital bed, I often found myself quietly wondering, how did we get here? Not judgmentally, curiously. What happened before this? What changed? What was missed? What was normalized? What was this person carrying? What happened in their environment? What happened in their body? What happened in their life? Turns out that part of nursing training never really leaves you. Years later, I found myself asking exactly the same questions about burnout. I couldn't look at the exhausted executive and see only the job. And I couldn't look at the burned out employee and see only the individual. I saw the intersection, the person, the work, the health context, the relationships, the responsibilities outside of work, the organizational conditions, the environment, the human being in context. And I knew what that felt like personally. I knew what it meant to be a high achiever whose capacity was deteriorating long before the outcome became obvious to anyone else. Hey, I won a teaching award the year I burned out. Okay? I get it. And when I reached that point, my employer treated burnout primarily as a me problem, something I needed to manage better, something I needed to recover from, something happening inside of me. And that's where they lost me. Because the more I studied burnout, the clearer something became. The individual may experience burnout, but the individual is not necessarily where burnout began. Burnout is a we problem. Now, when I say that, I don't mean everyone is equally responsible. Shared responsibility does not mean equal control. It means the story exists at more than one level. Individuals have agency and responsibility. Organizations have responsibility. The conditions surrounding people matter. The choices people make within those conditions matter. Both truths can exist at the same time. And this is where my work began to evolve. Instead of beginning with, is this person burned out? I became increasingly interested in what is this person carrying? What capacity is available to carry it? And how long has the relationship between those two been sustainable? That takes us into the human capacity advantage system. Human capacity is not simply energy. It includes the cognitive, emotional, physical, behavioral, relational, professional, and adaptive resources available to meet the demands of life and work effectively, ethically, and sustainably. Load is what those resources are being asked to carry, and capacity load alignment asks whether the demands being placed on a person are reasonably matched by the capacity, resources, recovery, and support available to carry them. When that alignment deteriorates over time, burnout can be one outcome, but it is not the only outcome. Misalignment may show up earlier as slower decision making, more mistakes, shorter patience, reduced creativity, withdrawal. Oh, how to go back? Withdrawal. I cannot say that today. Withdrawal, conflict, absenteeism, presenteeism, lower trust, reduced recovery, difficulty adapting, or a high performer quietly needing more and more effort to produce the same results. Some organizations wait for the burnout survey, but the system was speaking long before the survey arrived. It was speaking through repeated escalations, through managers who stopped developing people because they were drowning in task, through employees who stopped offering ideas because they no longer believed anything would change, through the leader who kept saying, once we get through this quarter, for 8 quarters in a row. Burnout is an outcome, and outcomes have histories. So, what are we normalizing? Okay, consider two people. One is a senior leader. The organization is under financial pressure. The team is understaffed. She's managing stakeholder expectations, employee morale, difficult decisions, constant meetings, and high visibility. Outside of work, she may also be caring for a parent, raising children, navigating a health issue, managing financial strain, grieving a loss, or simply carrying the accumulated demands of a life nobody sees when she walks into the boardroom. She continues performing, so people assume she's fine. The other is a frontline employee, reliable, skilled, trusted. Turnover has been high, so this person keeps covering gaps. And every few weeks, someone says, we just need you to help us get through this period. Except the period never ends. The employee starts skipping breaks, stops using time off, answers messages after hours, becomes the person everyone calls because they know the answer will be yes. Different roles, different levels of authority, different lives. But I want you to ask the same question about both. How long has the system been borrowing against this person's capacity? Because eventually something changes. Patience, judgment, health, engagement, relationships, performance. And then we look at the visible outcome and wonder what happened. What happened is that the temporary became normal. The overextension was renamed commitment. The reliable person became the default solution. The exceptional effort became the expected effort. And the system learned that it could continue functioning because someone kept absorbing the difference. We sometimes call people resilient when what we really mean is they haven't broken yet. That is not a sustainable operating model. And to the high achievers, I want to speak directly to you for a moment. Because many of you have been rewarded for carrying more than what was reasonable. You were praised for being reliable and available, praised for being strong, praised for being responsive, praised for being the person who figures it out, praised for being the calm one, praised for being the one who doesn't need much. And praise can become a trap when it teaches you to ignore the cost of being endlessly useful. So hear me clearly. Your capacity is not proof of your worth. Your exhaustion is not proof of your commitment. Your ability to endure is not the same as your ability to thrive. And the fact that you can carry something does not mean that you should carry it indefinitely. Capacity is a resource to steward, not a debt you owe everyone who has learned to depend on you. And leaders, be careful what your organization rewards. If recognition consistently goes to the people who absorb unreasonable load without complaint, you are teaching everyone what success requires. Whatever an organization repeatedly rewards eventually becomes part of its operating model. Reward chronic overfunctioning, and you will get more chronic overfunctioning. Normalized heroic effort and sustainable performance will eventually begin to look like underperformance. That isn't resilience, that's poor design wearing a cape. And eventually the cape gets heavy. I'm not only interested in whether a leader is burned out, I want to know what they're carrying before burnout becomes the outcome. Because if burnout is downstream, responsible leadership requires us to become much better at seeing upstream. That doesn't mean we can predict every case of burnout, and it doesn't mean every instance of high load will produce burnout. Human beings and organizations are more complex than that. It means we can ask better questions earlier. What is this leader carrying? Where is capacity being tested? What has changed? What is being compensated for? And what resources or support are available? And what has the organization quietly begun depending upon this person to absorb? Burnout may look like the moment someone ran out of resources. The more important leadership question is how long they had been losing them. And that brings me back to why this episode feels especially appropriate today. Burnout was the doorway into this work. Human capacity became the larger question. Burnout taught me to pay attention to depletion. Human capacity taught me to examine what people were being asked to carry before depletion occurred. Burnout led me toward recovery. Human capacity led me toward prevention, performance, leadership, and organizational design. And on my birthday, that evolution feels worth acknowledging. The work didn't abandon burnout, it grew upstream. Because if we can see it earlier, we can intervene earlier. If we can understand load before the outcome, We have more options. We can redesign, redistribute, clarify, resource, recover, stop, and sometimes simply admit this should never have become normal. Here is your one action for this week. Identify one chronic load that has been normalized, not a crisis, not the obvious major deadline everybody already knows is demanding. Look for something quieter, a standing meeting that no longer serves its purpose, an approval process that creates unnecessary friction, a role that expanded but was never redesigned, a leader who became the default problem solver, an employee who always covers because they're reliable, after hours communication that started during an emergency and somehow became permanent. Name one. Then ask 4 questions. Who is carrying it? What capacity does it consume? What is it producing? And does it still need to exist in its current form? Then consider, can it be reduced? Can it be redesigned? Can it be redistributed? Or can it be simply removed? The goal is not to solve every burnout risk this week. The goal is to stop treating chronic misalignment as normal. Because once you can see the load, you can question it. Once you can question it, you can redesign it. And once you can redesign it, you create the possibility of a different outcome. Before we close, I want to remind you, if you are struggling with burnout, burnout is not a character flaw. It is not a moral failure, and it is not proof that someone wasn't strong enough. Burnout is an outcome, and outcomes have histories. So don't wait for exhaustion to become undeniable before asking what the system has been saying. Look at the load. Look at the capacity available to carry it. Look at what has been normalized. Look at what the person or the organization has been compensating for. Because responsible leadership does not begin when someone finally says, I'm burned out. Responsible leadership begins much earlier. The work began with burnout for me, but it didn't end there. It grew upstream. And this is where the human capacity advantage begins. If you would like to continue the conversation beyond the podcast, you can find me on YouTube, Instagram, and LinkedIn at KHiresPhD. And that's it. If today's conversation resonated with you, subscribe and share this episode with someone who would benefit from it. You can continue the conversation with me and my team at thenightingalefirm.com. New episodes of the Human Capacity Advantage podcast are released every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. On Monday, the Monday Morning Capacity Check prepares you to approach the week with greater awareness and intention. On Wednesday, our main classroom episode develops your understanding of the research, workplace realities, and leadership practices in the Human Capacity Advantage system. And on Friday, the Human Capacity Sit Rep teaches you to look beneath the headlines, recognize the capacity challenges shaping our world, and consider what responsible leadership requires. Monday prepares you, Wednesday develops you, and Friday teaches you to see the world differently. Between now and our next class, pay attention to the world around you. Notice where human capacity is being strengthened, where it is being depleted, and where you may never have thought to look before. I'm Dr. Kim Hires. Thank you for joining me. Until next time, class dismissed.